With their unreviled power, the galactic conquerors came to Earth would not damage anyone. Their conceit prevented them from seeing how harsh the planet is. Their sophisticated physiology and technology provided them with every justification to think that the chilly areas of Earth would not damage anyone. Their conceit prevented them from seeing how harsh the planet is. Due to natural factors, the Arctic was a bleak, frozen environment, where understanding and respecting the environment was essential for existence. The Arctic sub-zero temperatures, strong winds, and even the most resilient explorers had been killed by continuous snowfields. Thus, the area was not simply chilly, it was a relentless foe for those who were not used with it. A location where one mistake may result in death, but it was still undervalued despite the fact that mankind hardly ever entered its frigid grasp without careful planning. The galactic overlords, they did not perceive the Arctic as a danger to them. In contrast to the harsh circumstances, Earth's climate appeared to be mild. Of other planets they had overrun, their armor, which was made to last, was more than sufficient for the majority of planets, and their ships were designed to withstand anything from volcanic heat to poisonous storms. Snow and a little cold would not matter to them. They wrote off Assisi regions as unimportant annoyances that weren't worth. Their worry was that they didn't understand that the cold on Earth was a test of endurance rather than merely a matter of temperature. Because of its adaptability and inventiveness, the Arctic wasn't just cold, it was a place to live. Unpredictable terrain, concealed hazards, and ever-changing weather were enough to humble even the most magical species. Because of the overlords' reliance on technology and physical power, the sophisticated species were oblivious to the deadly but subtle traps. So, when the overlords started their exploration, nature was waiting for the unprepared. Their advanced senses struggled to read the world they were in, which was unlike anything they had ever experienced. Their metal-based technology did not respond well to the freezing temperatures during heavy snowstorms, delaying and failing in unexpected ways, yet the rulers doubled down rather than admitting their shortcomings. They were certain they could get past these small annoyances, but they were unaware that someone had been observing them alone. A man, wrapped in bulky, worn equipment, crept silently across the frozen landscape. This individual was an Arctic survivor who had spent years surviving and thriving in this hostile environment. While the survivalists viewed the Arctic as their home, overlords regarded it as a challenge to conquer. They were aware of its perils, rhythms, and how to traverse its harsh terrain. This survivalist was no ha. Despite being a regular person, they were adept in their surroundings, having gained knowledge via sheer force. For them, the Arctic wasn't simply a task, it was a teacher that taught them how to succeed where others failed. Every frozen river, every shadowy nook, and every storm had taught lessons in resiliency, where the survivalists relied on technology and the overlords on tech. As the overlords struggled across the Arctic, their conceit started to show as they went, but experience and instinct carelessly piercing through ice that appeared thinner than it was, leaving traces of their existence that damaged the delicate environment by treating the Arctic the same way they treated every other planet as a resource to control and barrier to overcome. But the Arctic, unconcerned with their might, repelled them with ruthless winds and unrelenting cold. Although these invaders might have been strong enough to take over entire worlds, the survivalists watched with silent resolve. The survivalists were plainly out of their element here, and their errors were evident in the way they disregarded indications of danger, their disregard for the terrain they were walking on, and their underestimation of the storm that was approaching. It was becoming more and more obvious to the overlords that their typical tactics were failing their ships. Despite being built for interstellar travel, their armor was unable to withstand the intense cold. In the frigid conditions, the majority of attacks grew brittle, and the once competent overlords began to feel frost's insidious bite. The survivalists weren't satisfied with playing their hands safe. Here are a few elements from your research that I consider to be valid for predicting the future of the Arctic. And equipped only with their expertise, they weren't going to allow these invaders to jeopardize its delicate equilibrium. And cleverness? They were ready to pretend that the overlords were unaware of the real threat. As their situation deepened into the Arctic, they thought their superior technology would soon take over, but the Arctic didn't care much about the technology it required. The overlords' blinded arrogance was a result of their lack of humility and flexibility, them to the possibility that the same setting they disregarded would prove to be their downfall when the storm started to widen. Following the survivalists' initial action, they chose not to face the overlords head-on because there was no necessity to. The Arctic itself was the ideal ally because of its fluctuating ice, which concealed threats, and, despite the constant cold, the survivalists understood that letting go of the overlords was more important for victory than battling them. The Arctic did what it did best, testing everyone who dared to oppose it. Meanwhile, the rulers were ignorant of. There was no reason for the survivalists to think that any human could be a threat, but their absence of sympathy was vitally important, for they predicted the future possible for human civility. By awareness, they perceived power in terms of strength and technological capabilities. While the storm roared on the horizon, not in the tranquil fortitude of someone who had mastered one of Earth's hardest places, the overlords, in spite of their survivalists' readiness to employ every ability they had developed during years of living in the Arctic, because of their hubris, advanced technology was unaware of what was about to happen. When the cosmic conquerors landed in the Arctic, their ignorance and this frozen continent would determine what occurred next. With their typical assurance, they think that their sophisticated physiology and technology rendered them immune to the environment of Earth. The wide, cold plain in front of them showed them no immediate danger. Their equipment was flawless, their landing was accurate, and although they had high expectations, the Arctic was unlike anything they had ever experienced before. Confront difficulties for which they were unprepared or unanticipated. The first shock arrived very instantly, the searing. They had not thought about the cold seeping into their armor as a threat to the technology they had developed for harsh. Systems stalled, sensors malfunctioned, and planetary surroundings started to react negatively. The overlords observed changes as the cold air started to impact the fragile systems of their machines, yet dismissed them as mere annoyances, believing that the Arctic cold was harsher than what they had experienced, altered not just by the temperature, but also by an unceasing force that tried Ed's endurance and made their motions slow as they made their way across the terrain, with visibility being reduced by snowstorms. Their navigational aids were almost useless, unable to produce precise readings because to the swirling snow, the chaos of the winds deserved investigation. Due to garbled transmissions, blizzard contact between their units proved challenging, and sporadic. They persisted in believing their supremacy would triumph over their ignorance. Of the collision caused losses that added 16 to 18 lives and one. The navigational aids were almost useless, unable to produce precise readings because to the swirling stream of minds and intentions, garbage cannons gone half commented on their navigation. Due to garbled transmissions, blizzard cans were hiding an innocuousness prevent from weapons lost and personnel breaking contact. Existing of cracks concealed beneath the snow, waiting to capture anyone who ventured unwary among the unknown overlords. They ventured into dangerous ground, broke through ice, and miscalculated the dangers by acting carelessly. Because of Arctic's capacity to penalize errors, their conceit caused them to disregard the subliminal signals that someone encountered. Would have realized right away that someone was observing them from a distance. From a distance, survivalists familiar with the Arctic's customs watched the intruder's every action and slip-up. Was observed that the survivalist, who comprehended the overlord's struggle, that this place was a live, breathing environment rather than just snow and ice. The survivalists saw the overlord's reliance on technology as a weakness and a force that demanded respect. Their machines' striking designs weren't appropriate for the circumstances of the crazy overhead problems they were facing, and the overlords with yet another challenge they hadn't foreseen. In the frozen landscape, conventional resource extraction techniques were unsuccessful since the frozen solid ground resisted their energy supplies started to run out as they tried to drill or scan for materials. Quicker than anticipated, and they hadn't factored in the energy requirements of running their machinery in such severe cold, their conceit had made them think they wouldn't require backup plans for anything as simple as the weather on Earth. The overlords started to see the strain on their machinery when the hours stretched into days. Dependability began to wane when a layer of frost developed over their advanced equipment, resulting in some gadgets are useless, since their bodies are made to withstand a variety of conditions, battled to control their body temperature, and as a result, weariness and frostbite began to creep in. As the survivalists observed these developments, they found that a guarantee of victory was frequently insufficient against the Arctic. The overlords' haughtiness was evident in every move they made, with calm focus. They lacked a plan and no knowledge of the land. They behaved as though technology and physical force were the only ways to manipulate nature to suit their needs. Survivalists, however, were aware that the Arctic required patience, humility, and a profound awareness of its rhythms. Individuals who were unable to adjust would suffer repercussions regardless of how strong they thought they were. The overlords tried to reorganize and plan, but their increasing frustrations hampered their efforts. They were ill-prepared for the potential of failure and defeat. Their progress slowed to a halt, their equipment kept breaking down, and the environment wouldn't help. As the truth of their circumstances struck in, their spirits started to falter. They could not control the Arctic. They had to endure the increasingly severe testing and storms. The snow blinded them to the overlords in ways they had never thought of, and the winds sliced through their armor. As they attempted to stay warm, their already taxed energy supplies were pressed to the breaking point and powered their devices. Their worst flaw was their incapacity to adjust. The Arctic continued to unleash its fury despite their predicament, and all of the survivalists were invisible. Despite their sophisticated technology, the overlords were only a shadow in the distance. Belief that they were being observed, the survivalist observations exposed all of their flaws, mistakes, and judgments. The survivalists were aware that the overlords relied too heavily on technology and not enough on their instincts. As the overlords traveled more into the Arctic, their understanding of the land gave them the greatest advantage. The environment was unforgiving, the conflicts grew more intense, and their technology solutions were insufficient, and the cold kept leaking into every aspect of their business, from their machinery to their protective armor turned into a liability because the unrelenting chilly pressure caused their pride to freeze and break. When the strong started to fall, the Arctic exposed the overlords' weaknesses in ways they had never seen before. Prior to their conceit, their sense of invincibility was eroding. They had expected an easy victory when they arrived on Earth, but the Arctic proved them wrong. With survivalists observing from afar, saw that the terrain itself was the worst enemy. It wasn't something to be subdued, but rather something should be respected. However, it was too late when the overlords realized how dire their situation was. Their greatest strength, technology, had turned into their biggest weakness. The Arctic was unforgiving and showed no signs of pity to those who misjudged it. Their overlord efforts demonstrated their conceit and lack of preparation, and the fact that they had arrived on Earth as conquerors, yet refused to adapt. But the survivalists learned the Arctic because few people could ever hear every sound, which taught them a terrible lesson in humility. Every change in the wind meant that the surroundings were more than just a place. They were a challenge and a partner. Needed ongoing care, the survivalist had learned the secrets of the Earth for years and mastered the art of planning. Through observation and adaptation, they were able to survive every frozen storm, Fissure and snow-covered area provided a chance to hone their abilities. This information would prove to be their most potent weapon against the galactic overlords, who depended on raw force. Forest and technological superiority, but these instruments did not ensure success because their sensors had trouble distinguishing between solid ground and lethal ice. Their actions were methodical and noisy. Their equipment was too large for. In contrast, the survivalists navigated the Arctic's treacherous terrain, using precise and decision-making skills. Navigating with no computers and physical hands to serve and trained thwart who were strong, but oblivious to the subtleties of the Arctic provided them with countless chances to take advantage of the overlord's flaws. But they chose not to identify the early warning indicators of a storm approaching, or the minute changes in the eyes that suggested they were predictable because to their dependence on technology, but they were also reckless due to their conceit. In the meantime, survivalists turned the Arctic's natural surroundings into an ally. Had always been a site where endurance and resourcefulness were put to the test, and the survivalists knew how to employ its improvements. Despite having sophisticated tools, the overlords were ill-prepared to handle the subtle hurdles to their advantage. Hazards of the Arctic, they depended on equipment that did not take into consideration the terrain's unpredictable nature. Attempts to obtain resources or shelter frequently failed, leaving them vulnerable to the elements that the survivalists were familiar with. Their advanced equipment provided the overlord's strength, but that same strength turned into a liability in circumstances that called for adaptability and creativity. The survivalists lacked need for cutting-edge technology. Their instruments were straightforward but efficient, made out of necessity and experience. They were able to easily explore the Arctic thanks to tools and a thorough knowledge of the terrain. Believed that the environment was a living thing that needed to be respected by the overlords, not a barrier. Arrogance was unable to see this basic fact. Every mistake the overlords made presented a new chance. The overlord found it difficult to keep everyone together as their equipment malfunctioned, and the survivalists gained the upper hand. As their self-confidence declined, the survivalists utilized every second to evaluate their shortcomings. They saw how the lords responded to the weather, how they handled the terrain, and how their over-reliance on technology made them vulnerable because every move they made was premeditated. Step toward revealing their weaknesses, the survivalists' edge was not limited to their minds. The overlords used brute force because of their strategic thinking and understanding of the Arctic. Using their technology to tackle issues, they were left frantically looking for answers when it malfunctioned. The survivalists realized that by altering the environment, they could turn the Arctic itself into a weapon. Place the overlords in predicaments where their technology would malfunction. Their incapacity to adjust was their worst flaw, was that they acted as if the Arctic could be manipulated. But the survivalists were wise enough to know better. The land was uncontrollable and could only be comprehended. This comprehension provided the survivalists with a sense of suspense. While the overlords depended on pre-programmed solutions, they lacked the clarity of purpose. The survivalists depended on their instincts and first-hand knowledge. Their affinity for the Arctic was not only useful, but years of intensely intimate time spent in the frozen wilderness had created a connection between them and the Arctic. Harsh but fair, rewarding those who respected its authority. The survivalists had learnt this lesson early on, and it had influenced every facet of their lives. They punished anyone who didn't. Due to their survival strategy and pride, the overlords had to learn this lesson the hard way. Encountered additional difficulties, their incapacity to adjust became more apparent, and they tried to rely on using physical force to get beyond barriers, but the Arctic refused to give up its prey. When faced with the forces of nature, advanced equipment and weaponry were ineffective due to their arrogance, which had served them well on other worlds, turned into a deadly weakness in the face of the Arctic's unrelenting might. Conversely, the survivalists prospered due to their ability to adapt. They were aware of this. Direct conflict would not result in victory, because the overlords were physically superior and armed with sophisticated technology. Yet, in the Arctic, physical force was useless without an. Given their knowledge of the terrain, the survivalists' approach was to allow the environment, knowing that the Arctic would reveal every flaw, magnify every error, and test every belief that the overlords, in spite of their advanced powers, were becoming weaker by the second. They had always relied on technology, but it was seriously failing them. Their once imposing armor broke under the relentless cold, their machinery froze, and their sensors failed. Despite their lack of preparation for the harsh realities of the Arctic, the survivalists stayed resilient and determined. Every action they took and every choice they made was informed by a thorough knowledge of the terrain that the survivalists were blind to. The overlords believed they were unbeatable, but their flaws were obvious overconfidence, reliance on technology, and a basic misperception of their surroundings. The survivalists had previously encountered difficult circumstances, and the masters the land itself would prove to be their downfall, just like any other difficulty the Arctic had provided. The survivalists were ready to make sure that their strategy was methodical and patient, and the Arctic showed the rulers the importance of waiting and letting the circumstances work in their favor. Power was unable to stop forces they couldn't control or predict. Survivalists realized that outlasting the adversary in the Arctic was more important for survival than defeating them. Was a classroom as much as a battlefield, and the survivalists had learned their lessons just as well as the overlords had. As the survivalists' confidence increased, they realized that time was on their side and that the Arctic had a way of the survivalists failed to recognize the overlords because they exposed conceit and punished those who undervalued its strength. As invaders who had miscalculated the terrain they were trying to control, rather than as conquerors, the survivalist relationship to the Arctic's mastery of its secrets and reverence for its difficulties made them a formidable force to the overlords. Couldn't defeat the Arctic, which had shown itself to be a merciless foe, stealing the overlords' trust. What they had previously written off as a minor annoyance had gradually turned into a relentless assault on their modern machinery that was supposed to operate perfectly, had become unreliable. Now, bodies designed for endurance fought against the relentless cold. Every mistake they made moved them one step closer to catastrophe, and their annoyance eventually turned to despair. The turning point started with the overlords, who were used to overwhelming their adversaries, realized that their standard strategies were no longer effective, depending on technology and physical strength, although their influence appeared to be waning in the face of a setting that would not accommodate their wishes. Their inability to comprehend the subtleties of the cold made them vulnerable for nature itself to stand in their way. They undervalued the significance of the slightest elements, such as how the wind could steal and how snow could hide dangerous cracks, body heat more quickly than their systems could adjust, and how each failure might cause visibility to suddenly disappear, compounded the next, resulting in a losing cycle they were unable to escape because of what their prior conquest had taught them. Domination came naturally to them, but in this case, it was unimportant, and the overlords started to split as a result of their errors. Their unity, which had formerly been their distinguishing strength, was disintegrating as arguments on how to proceed broke out as frustration grew, but there was no resolution. They had reached the Arctic as conquerors, but the environment made each step more difficult than the one before, had diminished them to mere survivors holding on to limited supplies, the survivalists remaining hidden, while the overlords' increasing difficulties, their shortcomings, and their incapacity to change, their dependence on outdated technologies, and their lack of knowledge about the cycles of the Arctic. These same difficulties had been encountered by the survivalist, but they were surmounted by reverence for the nature and an awareness of its requirements. The survivalists observed the overlords as a collection of unprepared people rather than invincible creatures. Because of the truth of their circumstances, they grew increasingly reckless in their attempts to push forward, turned frantic, and as their panic grew, they attempted to use their weapons to etch through the ice, but their attempts only served to exacerbate the situation by causing explosions. Heavy equipment burst through the unstable terrain during avalanches, and their energy reserves depleted more quickly with each return. Every action they took seemed to backfire on their unrelenting futile quest to retake control of the Arctic. The overlords' hubris and superiority complex caused them to realize they were outmatched too late, had made them oblivious to the risks they faced. They were battling not just the cold, but also their own arrogance. The survivalists recognized that adaptability, not strength, was what was needed to survive. The Arctic was a force to be endured rather than an enemy to be vanquished, despite the overlords' attempts to. The environment continued to oppose their efforts to reorganize and recover, and their technology was unable to safeguard them. Their tactics failed, and their spirits collapsed. They were no longer a unified group, but rather a collection of people battling overwhelming circumstances. The survivors, seeing from afar, observed their defeat. Due to their refusal to adapt, the overlords were unable to win the inevitable conclusion. The Arctic just waited, revealing the overlords' vulnerabilities one by one without having to launch a frontal attack. People who visited the Arctic without realizing its strength have already witnessed this, according to survivalists. Only to be humiliated by its lack of concern, the overlords' demise was not different despite their superior strength. Not the outcome of a single incident, but rather the accumulation of all errors, underestimations, and failures to adjust by the time the lords realized how serious their predicament was. They had few options because they had nowhere to go or someone to call for help. They went into the Arctic with the intention of dominating, but now they have reinforcements and no way to fix their malfunctioning equipment. Their equipment breaks down more quickly than they can fix it, and as their energy supplies diminished and they had no means of restocking them, the Arctic was triumphing without aggressiveness. But the overlords' unwavering perseverance allowed them to overcome obstacles that threatened the foundation of their strategy. Their technology had turned from a strength to a weakness. Electronics shorted out, malformed in the cold, and their advanced suits started to malfunction. They had prepared for human resistance and did not expect the Arctic to negate their advantages. Revealing the overlords' vulnerabilities one by one without having to launch a frontal attack, people who visited the Arctic without realizing its strength have already witnessed this, according to survivalists. Only to be humiliated by its lack of concern, the overlords' demise was not different despite their superior strength. Not the outcome of a single incident, but rather the accumulation of all errors, underestimations, and failures to adjust by the time the lords realized how serious their predicament was. They had few options because they had nowhere to go or someone to call for help. They went into the Arctic with the intention of dominating, but now they have reinforcements and no way to fix their malfunctioning equipment. They were barely able to survive because of their conceit, which led them here, and their disregard for the environment. The survivalists remained underground, ready for the latter steps of the overlord's overthrow, having secured their doom. There was no need to take direct action because the Arctic was already carrying out the overlord's tasks. Become their own worst enemy because of their dependence on technology and inability to change, which leaves them exposed to survival. It's realized that the Arctic would declare victory based on endurance rather than conflict. Because the overlords outlasted them, their defeat was not characterized by one spectacular moment, but their machines gradually and irrefutably collapsed. They had come to Earth, but their supplies ran out, and their once indomitable spirits were broken. They were forced to face the fact that, despite their belief in their invincibility, the Arctic had showed them that they were aware of the limitations of their strength, and the fact that nature was an enemy they could not defeat. Because the survivalists were not surprised by this result, because the Arctic had always been a harsh environment for visitors. The overlords would fail those who disregarded it as unimportant, but those who honored its power may live. The survivalists had lost everything because, despite their strength and technological prowess, they had misjudged the Arctic. Had witnessed everything previously, but never on this magnitude. The lesson was evident in the Arctic was a force to be admired rather than subjugated. The rulers had discovered this too late in their arrogance, giving the survivalists the impression that they could manage something they couldn't because they had experienced the difficulties of the Arctic, understood that adaptation and knowledge were more important for survival than power or technology, was the reality that the galactic tyrants had disregarded, and it was the truth that ultimately brought them to ruin. Sci-Fi had gone into the Arctic with great confidence, but they came away feeling humbled and having lost faith in their survival. They had discovered too late that not all battles were won, shattering their invincibility built by innumerable conquests, are achieved by using technology and strength. The Arctic had taught them that nature never gives up. What had appeared to be a trivial setting turned into a force that could reveal their worst weaknesses due to arrogance. Their downfall had been the overlords' conceit, as they had undervalued the Arctic, considering it only another challenge to overcome. Their blindness to the hazards of a world they did not understand was caused by their trust in their technology. Realized that they disregarded the hints that someone who knew the area would have recognized their defects. When those machines malfunctioned, their dependence on them left them exposed, and their pride kept them from adjusting to the fact that the Arctic was an adversary that required respect and not a battleground they could dominate. In sharp contrast, survivalists prospered due to their reverence for the Earth. Years of experience had taught them to realize the need for humility and careful planning in the Arctic setting, where the overlords depended on brute might as a force to coexist with rather than as a challenge to overcome. Understanding the terrain was essential to the survivalists, who rewarded those who adjusted, and the overlords discovered that the survivalists' expertise was more valuable than any cutting-edge weapon or gear. Their failure demonstrated the limitations of their strategy, which required more than just physical might to survive. Always depended on defeating their adversaries. But the Arctic was unbeatable and showed no concern for their feebleness. Whether it was their physical strength or technology, it required a patient approach and a readiness to learn. The overlords' inability to adjust demonstrated the brittleness of their ostensibly unassailable power. Triumph, a survivalist, demonstrated human adaptation and resiliency, while when the overlord's technology failed, the survivalists' basic equipment and in-depth knowledge of the Arctic won out. The survivalist had mastered the ability to read the Earth and its rhythms, recognize warning signs, and be ready for whatever. In the end, their success came from understanding how to work with the environment rather than against it, not from strength. It was evident from the Arctic that haughtiness is a liability and flexibility is essential. Lords had depended on their sense of superiority, but the Arctic had destroyed that, revealing their vulnerabilities and made them face their power limitations. Thus, the survivalist triumph wasn't finished yet. The rulers knew well that with the presumption that the best way to survive in the Arctic was to be dominant, the overlord's defeat was the only real victory, and it had wider implications, consequences they had expected an easy conquest when they arrived on Earth, but they came away with a renewed appreciation for its nurture, world-breaking developments like the engine that pushed floods of people away. They were humbled by the Arctic's obstacles in a way that no adversary had ever done before, reevaluate their strategy for controlling their technology while in power, not only on Earth but in any environment, was not perfect. Their tactics, which worked well elsewhere, had to be rethought in this situation. Their strategies, in the hopes of preventing a recurrence of this failure for the survivalists, that the experience confirmed the importance of their knowledge and experience after overcoming what many would believe to be an insurmountable obstacle and come out on top. Their triumph did not come from overthrowing the lords, but about persevering despite the insurmountable odds that their survivalist ties to the Arctic had provided them. The resources they required to achieve their victory served as a reminder that acknowledging and honoring one's departure signaled the end of a chapter. But the drama continued, since the environment is crucial to survival. Despite being humbled, they were not permanently defeated. They would return more wary and equipped. They had learned to appreciate the natural forces in the Arctic, but it was unclear if they had actually learned the deeper lesson. Their conceit had been stopped, but it was unclear if humility had taken its place. Survivalists were aware that this victory was fleeting and that caution would be required in the event of a confrontation between the Arctic and the overlords, brought to light a universal truth. Nature is the supreme understanding, and respecting the Arctic is essential for survival, regardless of one's level of power or sophistication. Didn't pick sides. It just put everyone who went in to the survivalist's test. Passed that test with knowledge rather than strength, and the overlords had failed it with wisdom rather than weakness. The overlord's lost story became a lesson for others due to hubris. It reminded them that no technology might take the role of the necessity for environmental stewardship and adaptation, which the Arctic was known for. Of extremes, yet its lessons were universal, demonstrating that surviving requires not dominance, but rather the ability to. The survivalist personified this concept by living within the limitations of their environment, serving as a representation of what humanity could accomplish by being resilient and realizing how powerful the rulers had been brought low because they believed the Arctic was a sea hurdle that they needed to overcome, but they had. Underestimating its intricacy, they failed not only because of the snow or the cold, but also because they refused to adapt. Although they had written off the survivalists as unimportant, their expertise and experience that turned out to be crucial. The Arctic had selected its winner not on the basis of strength. However, the survivalist triumph was a low-key one, characterized not by spectacular displays, but by extreme dexterity. Their accomplishment, which they achieved where others failed, was evidence of the need of planning, patience, and respect for the Arctic. The Arctic natural forces had put them to the test, just as they had put everyone who entered. They had come out stronger as a result, defeating not only the rulers but also the notion that strength is all that is needed. The overlords departed the Arctic with a fresh perspective on how to guarantee survival. Constraints they had arrived with the intention of dominating, but their own conceit had defeated them, failed them, and their plans had not worked. The Arctic had demonstrated to them the strength of nature and the friendliness. It remained to be seen if they would actually learn the value of humility from this experience, but one thing was evidently, the Arctic had shaped them. In the meantime, the survivalists went back to knowing that the overlords would return at some point. They had to return to their life in the Arctic, where they confronted an incredible challenge and demonstrated that knowledge and resiliency might defeat even the most sophisticated opponents. For the survivalists, the Arctic's lessons were as uncompromising as its cold terrain. The goal of the victory was to demonstrate that the Arctic could not be subjugated solely by conquering the overlords. Honored.